Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Warm hellos and regards from the ancient city of Herat. What a great pleasure to be here for a few minutes and spend some time with you and share some moments with you and share some thoughts with you. My name is Dr. Aryan Sharifi, and I'll have the pleasure of moderating this panel on the bilateral relations between the United States and Afghanistan as part of the Herat Security Dialogue of 2020. Now, in the past years, I have attended this landmark event many times in the past years, and in the past years, we had the pleasure of spending a few days in this beautiful city in the company of some of the most distinguished experts on Afghanistan and foreign relations in general. This year, however, unfortunately, given the COVID pandemic, we don't have that pleasure. Nevertheless, it's still great to be here, thinking nostalgically about the past year and having some hope for the next year. And the hope is that by this time of the year next year, we'll have the pandemic all over and we'll be back, all of us, in Herat, in the company of each other and talking face to face. Now, many panels have been proposed as part of the Herat Security Dialogue of 2020, but in my view, the panel on Afghanistan and United States bilateral relations are one of the most important panels because why? Because we are really at a crossroads of these relations, especially after the past 19 years of really expansive and intense bilateral relations between the two countries. I had the pleasure of having with me 5 distinguished speakers. I have Professor Michael Barry, who is currently in Venice. He's joining us from Venice. I have Mr. Lonis Koskenes from the Middle East. I have Ms. Pamela Constable from the United States. She's in Washington, D.C. I have Ms. Nargis Azariyoun and Mr. Mohammad Voizi from Kabul joining us for this panel. What I'm going to do is give you a very quick rundown of the bilateral relations between Afghanistan and the United States in the historical perspective, and then come up to the current situation, pose a few very generic questions to the panelists, and then have each panelist speak for about 10 minutes in any aspects of these bilateral relations. I'm just asking the panelists to keep in the back of their minds the generic questions that I'm posing here. But again, feel free to speak to any aspect of these relations. Most of the questions that I pose here are mainly state-centric, state-to-state relations. But again, these are 2 different countries, these are 2 different societies. So apart from the state-centric questions, please do feel free to talk about the society-centric aspects of these relations. With that, let me give you a very quick background of the bilateral relations between the United States and Afghanistan, and then we will kick off the panel thereafter. Now, formal relations between Afghanistan and the United States began in 1921, when for the first time, King Amanullah of Afghanistan sent an official delegation to the White House. Upon that visit, the United States officially recognized Afghanistan as a sovereign state, but diplomatic relations were established in 1935 when William Harnybrook presented his credentials to the Afghan government as the non-resident US ambassador to Afghanistan. He was covering Iran at the same time, as well. Later on, the US established a legation in Kabul in 1942, which was then elevated to embassy status on June 5, 1948, when Ellie Palmer, as the first resident US ambassador to Kabul, presented his credentials to the Shah. On February 14, 1979, the US ambassador Adolf Dubs was assassinated in Kabul, but the embassy continued to be run by charge d'affaires until 1989, when it was closed due to concerns of insecurity with the departure of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Afghan-American relations resumed, albeit at a much more expansive and tighter way, with the establishment of the Interim Authority of Afghanistan in December 2001. Since then, the 2 countries have enjoyed close relations through established diplomatic relations, strategic partnership agreements, as well as successive NATO missions in Afghanistan. This long and expansive American presence in Afghanistan has been aimed at disrupting, countering terrorism and insurgency, state building, nation building, economic development, and reconstruction. While much has been achieved to those ends over the past almost 2 decades, Afghanistan still suffers from intense terrorism and violence, pervasive corruption and organized crime, abject poverty, meager economy, weak state, and broken society. And the United States still fights an ostensibly unwinnable war. Given the above scenario, the United States is contemplating a withdrawal of its military forces from Afghanistan and is really pushing for a hasty peace deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. This would mean a major milestone in Afghan-American relations, generating new challenges and opportunities as we go forward. Many questions remain to be answered, which this panel would address over the next hour and 10 minutes, in fact. I would like to put a few issues on the table and ask the panelists to take them into account as they present their remarks during the panel. And some of the questions: knowing that international relations are primarily driven by interests, not friendships, what are the real American interests in Afghanistan? What are Afghanistan's interests in its relations with the United States? To what extent are the two countries' interests aligned? In what way, if any, are they divergent? Are there any conflicting areas? How does the United States' interest in the region impact its policy towards Afghanistan? How important is Afghanistan to the United States' interests in the region? How does Afghanistan's relations with its near and far neighbors impact its relations with the United States? How could Afghanistan pursue its now stated foreign policy of multilateralism and multi-alignment, given the strategic environment? Is there an option for the United States' engagement in Afghanistan between total withdrawal and infinite continuation of the status quo? What would that be? How would that serve both countries' interests? Do Americans and Afghans know each other really well? How much does that matter? How could mutual understanding between the two societies be improved? A possible question is, how will the Biden administration differ in Afghanistan from that of Trump's administration? Well, I posed another question, but by now that question is void, and that was, well, really, if Trump were to win the elections, will he really go with the total withdrawal? These are some of the very generic questions that I thought, mainly state-centric, as I mentioned earlier, but also getting into the details of the society-to-society relations as well. Again, very generic questions as overall picture. Please, distinguished speakers, talk to any aspect of these relations that you think, as experts on these relations, as people who have spent years and years working in the United States, in Afghanistan, on these relations, whatever you think our viewers should know and should hear. With that, I'll stop my remarks here, and I am going to request Professor Dr. Michael Barry to start his remarks, and then we'll go to the next panelists. Again, let me remind you that each of the panelists have 10 minutes to present their remarks, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you very much. Dr. Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And briefly and bitterly, to phrase it, Afghanistan, in the eyes of the United States, I believe, has been primarily a negative space, meaning that American priorities in Afghanistan, especially since 1979, have focused on denying Afghan space to a hostile entity threatening American interests and world interests, rather than specific interest in Afghanistan as such. This negative aspect of what I would call Afghan geopolitics, even over the last 2 centuries, has been repeatedly verified with the various British interventions in Afghanistan, which were not aimed in the positive sense of exploiting Afghan resources and developing the country as a profitable colony, No, the British interventions were negative. Deny Afghan space to Russia. The two American interventions have also been primarily negative. The first, underhand through Pakistan, deny Afghan space to Soviet influence. And the second, and still ongoing, deny Afghan space to a terrorist political grouping that could once again threaten the American homeland or American interests around the world. What I find fascinating in the way that Afghan leaders who proved shrewd enough to understand the mainly negative focus of the foreign powers was how to negotiate with the foreign power once having understood properly what the foreign power wanted, and to extract from such a negotiation benefits for the building of the Afghan state, meaning literally Dost Muhammad and Abdur Rahman in the 19th century negotiating with the British. You want the Russians out? So do we. You have to keep Afghanistan stable so we can keep the Russians out for you. Therefore, give us economic aid to rebuild the Afghan state. And we find ourselves paradoxically very much in the same situation now, where the United States has been indicating through the Trump administration, which after all commanded significant support in the United States. The Trump administration has been basically saying, with its usual bluntness, we have no positive interest in Afghanistan, not its society, not the emancipation of Afghan women, not social justice, not sanitation for Kabul, none of these things. The negative proposition that the Trump administration's negotiating team have been placing before Afghanistan, and notably through the Taliban, guarantee to us that Afghanistan will not be a hostile space to us, and we have no further interest in the country. Here I will raise some criticisms. The kind of attitude that I'm indicating is one that is deeply painful to me. I don't agree with that perspective. I don't think it is defensible on moral, ethical, humanitarian grounds, but I do believe that it is the responsibility, and it has been over 19 wasted years, the responsibility of Afghan leadership to convince enough Americans of the positive interest in Afghanistan. And this has not succeeded clearly. I'll conclude with two aspects. Number one, I believe, I may be wrong, and I'm sure that the other experts on the panel will correct me if I am mistaken. I believe that the negative importance of Afghanistan is still of such overwhelming weight for the American military and security personnel that they will argue with the Biden administration to leave sufficient forces in Afghanistan permanently to deny Afghanistan to any particular terrorist group. And this, I think, is weighty. And the example of the precipitous American withdrawal from Iraq a few years ago weighs very much in military minds. That doesn't mean that Mr. Biden has a positive interest in Afghanistan, but he might be convinced, and I think he will be convinced, by the negative interest. Number two, you know that I am part of those Americans who believe that the ongoing United States feud with Iran is sterile, disastrous, and has wrought havoc in every society surrounding Iran, where you happen to have both Sunni and Shiite communities in varying proportions. And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, one of the terrible outcomes of this constant US-Iranian confrontation is that the United States pushes aside the one power in the region which actually has an invested interest in maintaining the stability of the Afghan state. Because if the Afghan state were to disintegrate, either Iranian forces would be sucked into Afghanistan to protect Ali Tashayo, people of Shi'i persuasion, or hundreds of thousands of Afghan Shi'is will seek refuge in Iran. This is why, materially speaking, not to mention humanitarian and ethical concerns, it is in Tehran's interest, as it is in Washington's interest, to see a stable government in Kabul. Obviously, I'm drawing the contrast with the other country, which is Pakistan, which has a fundamental interest in keeping Afghanistan destabilized. And we could go into all the reasons. I'll conclude by saying that the feud between the United States and Iran has regional consequences which could be compared to the feud between the United States and China in the 1950s and 1960s. Wars involving US troops on the periphery of China throughout the 50s and 60s. Wars involving US troops around the periphery of Iran ever since 1979. Lessening of regional tensions, of ethnic tensions, sectarian tensions, through resumption of dialogue between Tehran and Washington, and finally between Tehran and Kabul, because the prosperity of Afghanistan is bound up with open trade with the Gulf, with Chobandar, with the possibility for countries in Central Asia to import and export through Afghan territory by way of access to the Gulf. And this can only happen with restoral of a world dialogue between Washington and Tehran, which I hope this administration will usher back in.
Thank you very much, Professor Barry. It's an amazing analysis. I remember even years back, I mentioned earlier, when I was at Princeton as a student, you were always talking about the importance of the strategic importance of Iran to Afghanistan and to the United States relations and interests in the region if we have Iran on board on a certain platform. That's something I remember from years back. And again, the more I personally think about that, I absolutely agree with you. Such an important point. The other important point that I personally had not really thought about it in that regard is the negative space, the negative interest of the United States that you mentioned on Afghanistan. It's very obvious in certain aspects that the United States is mainly here. I mean, the United States first came to Afghanistan because of a negative cause, because it was attacked by certain individuals, by certain group, albeit not Afghan, but that were residing in Afghanistan. So to start really this expansive, a tightened relation that I talked about in the beginning, going back to the late 2001 between the United States and Afghanistan, it actually started on a negative point. And it really continued on a negative issue. And an amazing and a great analysis. Thank you, Dr. Barry. We'll come back to you on that issue later on. But now I'd like to go to Ms. Constable. Now, let me, since this video is going to be edited, I have, not that any of you really need an introduction, but I have the introductions for each of the speakers. At the end of the video, I'm going to read those introductions and then I'll ask our technical colleagues to put that in the specific parts. The reason I'm not doing the introduction right now is that I actually have it on my mobile phone and I can't access it right now, so it's a technical issue. They will edit it and the proper introduction will come to place. Now I would like to go to Ms. Constable. Ms. Constable, I was wondering what you think about this entire scenario and how how the United States-Afghanistan bilateral relations are going to evolve. But particularly, I would like to also ask you to kind of touch base, if you will, in your remarks about the 2 points, two of the main points that Dr. Barry mentioned. Number one, is there a way, even if we were to speak specifically on military strategic terms, is there a way to translate this negative space into a positive space in these bilateral relations, i.e., maybe a joint defense agreement, perhaps some of the other strategic interests the United States may have in the region that Afghanistan could help with? I don't know. Is there a way that these negative interests could be translated into positive interests, even in that strategic realm? And again, also the number 2 points, what would you think the Biden administration would do in its Afghanistan policy, specifically on Iran?
That's a lot for 10 minutes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Is it?
We can hear you well.
Just speak?
We can hear you well, thank you.
And I just wanted to say one thing. When you asked me if I'd ever been to Herat, I was thinking back to my first visit, which was in 1998, when Governor Kharkhwa, the Taliban governor there, was doing quite an interesting job. He was a rather, I hate to say the word liberal, but I would say moderate leader there, who was trying to institute some very interesting changes, including things like reducing dowry costs. And it was a very interesting time in Herat, which has always been an interesting place. I've been working in Afghanistan off and on for the past 22 years. So I don't want to comment on things before that time. I'm happy to comment about how I see things moving ahead, although naturally, as an American journalist, I cannot take sides in an election. But I would say I'd like to address this issue of negative space. I see Afghanistan differently in the sense of, for the United States and for the West. And Afghans have said this for forever and ever and ever. It's all about where we are. It's our strategic location in the region and the world that makes Afghanistan important, not just the fact that it's an interesting country per se. It's always been at a crossroads of travel, of change, of civilizations moving around, of conflict. It's always been in the thick of things. So I don't see that necessarily as a negative, as so much as a situational or strategic thing that has hurt in some cases and helped in others. I guess that's how I'd put it. The relationship between the United States and Afghanistan, as you know, has been varied, almost vertiginous. I think even though I don't want to talk about past history, you know, the moment and the point that most Afghans remember and think about and worry about is when the Americans withdrew after the Soviet withdrawal. That's the thing that I think Afghans are most worried about, a return to some sort of cataclysmic break or upheaval. And you know, I remember the day the Taliban came into Kabul. I wasn't there, I was in the States, but I picked up a newspaper and I saw a picture of Dr. Najibullah hanging from a lamppost. And I thought, oh my God, it's happening again. Afghanistan does not need more convulsive change. The last thing it needs is convulsive ideological reinvention and cataclysm. I think the best Afghans can and should hope for is, as you mentioned previously, some sort of a continuity of stability, of an ability to get beyond these cataclysmic changes. At the moment, things are stuck. Talks are stuck for a variety of reasons. The violence is up, both from Taliban and from other groups. It's not a happy moment. It's not a positive, forward-looking moment. It's a very worrisome moment because much is in the balance. I think that many Afghans have been very upset about the United States policy in recent months. They feel that the Americans gave too generous a deal to the Afghans in the February agreement, and that this has in part enabled
The
or
Taliban,
contributed to, sorry?
too generous a deal to the Taliban, you meant.
To the Taliban.
To the Taliban, correct, yes, thank you, in their agreement. And that this has contributed to the essential stalemating of the current talks between Taliban and prominent Afghans. And the Taliban seem to feel that they are in a position to keep making war. So it's a very worrisome moment. I think everyone would agree. Now, if you look at the transition that's happening in Washington, I think there's a great opportunity there. There's a great opportunity in many ways, including the relationship with Afghanistan. I think that President Biden, if he comes to office, is more likely to sort of go back to a more traditional approach to Afghanistan. He is going to listen probably much more closely to the US military than President Trump has done on what they would advise. And I agree with some of the comments Professor Barry made about the sort of the broader regional or military, it's not the Afghan interest per se that has guided the US military's interest, but more of a regional concern with reason. Look at who the neighbors are. Look at how reliable or unreliable they are in terms of relationships with the rest of the world. So I think that it's understandable that the US has always viewed Afghanistan in terms of where it is and who the neighbors are. So having said that, I do think that a Biden administration would also be very interested in the flip side of what Professor Barry said, which is trying to bring a positive, look at it as positive space. What can we do? President Ghani has had his ups and downs, but he's always been sort of a visionary person who's always trying to propose positive things. Many of them haven't gone that far, but he's always talking about connectivity and regionality and all these wanting to reach out. If there's a way to bring peace, if there's a way to bring stability, which we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how much possibility there is for any sort of real power sharing. But if it's possible, then I think the field is wide open for a variety of positive developments bilaterally and regionally. I have to say also that, again, going back to the regional issue, I think the Biden administration is going to be keenly interested in dealing with Iran. I can't know, but I suspect that a Biden administration would want to revive the deal with Iran that was canceled by the Trump administration. It seems like a possibility. I think the Biden administration is going to be worried about Russia. It's going to be worried about China. It's going to be always thinking of Afghanistan strategically, but not wanting to ignore it as a country on its own. I think it will be bringing expertise, history, perhaps former ambassadors, perhaps former experts who've spent time in Afghanistan to come back and be consulting. I think a Biden administration would be very consultative, both domestically and internationally. So I think you would see a change of tone, of interest, and I think that would probably be a good thing. Again, I don't want to overstate the case. I do think that there is as much concern about the region as there is about Afghanistan. The hope would be that it can change in the way Professor Barry mentioned, from being a negative to a positive for everyone. That's a hope. We don't know how realistic or unrealistic. The immediate prospects are not good, but hopefully a different American administration might be able to contribute to turning it in more a positive direction.
Thank you, Pamela. You truly raised quite a few really important questions. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the traditional approach to Afghanistan. You mentioned that the Biden administration might take a more traditional approach. You did talk about certain aspects of it. I was just wondering if you could clarify that phrase a little bit further.
I mean, obviously, it's hard to describe many phases in one phrase. What I really meant to say, or more clearly to say, is that I think a Biden administration would take a broader approach. Perhaps that's the best way to put it. There have been very negative moments, as we mentioned, a great fear of abandonment of American abandonment after the Soviet withdrawal. So it hasn't been an easy or particularly smooth history, but there have been, if you look back, 2001, 2002, the first 5 years, let's say I was living in Kabul for all of that time. I moved to Kabul as soon as the Taliban fell and lived there, very intensive time of great building. The word nation building became an unhappy phrase, but there was a lot of it going on. And I met hundreds of international people, both Afghan and foreign, who were coming to Afghanistan to help rebuild it. It was a very positive time, and many accomplishments were made. For many reasons we all know, the Iraq War, other things happening, Taliban got a chance to come back, and things have deteriorated since then. But if you look at that period of time, just those 5 years, and the relationship that Afghanistan had with not only the Americans, but a variety of international partners, that might be a model. That might be the better thing to say than traditional, but rather let's look at that phase, and perhaps one could hope that a phase like that could come again.
Great. No, that all makes sense, and obviously it's we still have quite a few weeks to see what happens in the meantime over the next 2 months of the transition, and then once the Biden administration takes office, see what they really think. Not that I'm making any presumptions, but obviously, there are always differences between campaign slogans and actual actions when politicians get to office. So all of that are to be seen. Thank you very much, Ms. Constable, for that. I might get back to some of the points with you towards the end. Right now, I'd like to go to Ms. Nargis Ozariyun. Nargis John, you've been an activist in Afghanistan. You've been involved in a lot of civil society work, a lot of peace building work, if you will, the way I define that sentence. What do you think the peace negotiations are headed with the change in the administration in Washington, D.C.? Now, again, I'm an Afghan, but I've also been part of the Afghan government and outside of the Afghan government and on the sidelines and inside and outside for the past 6-7 years. And I've been watching this issue very closely. What I can say, again, as an observer, is that not many of the Afghans were actually happy the way the peace negotiations were going on under Ambassador Khalilzad and under the Trump administration, because as Ms. Constable stated and Professor Barry also kind of alluded to, perhaps the United States was giving way too much to the Taliban. First of all, was that the correct course of action? Was that an okay course of action to go? Second, how do you see that course of action changing now with Biden coming into the White House?
Thank you. I want to say I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. Hello, Professor Barry. It's very good to see you again, and everyone in the panel. Like Professor Barry has said, I think there was a lot of misunderstandings. There was a lot of challenges that the peace process created in the initial stages. And I think that it is fair to say that there was a lot of fear among Afghans when the discussion about the withdrawal and the timeline for withdrawal started. And like you've mentioned, there was a lot of challenges into how the peace negotiations were being handled. Information was not flowing, and I don't think that anybody in Afghanistan had a sense about what was really going on. Given the government, the civil society, nobody really knew what was the plan there. I think the major problem was because the United States itself didn't have a coherent plan for the peace process in Afghanistan. It was a rush process. We know that a lot of groups within the Trump administration were against the peace process. Some of them didn't know anything about the peace process or how it was being handled. Information was being kept. Some were really for it, and I think we all agree that there was a rush in order to get it done before the elections of the United States, which didn't happen. And that created a lot of challenges for the Afghanistan, fueled the challenges that were already here, that were creating a barrier for the peace talks to move forward. It would be very hard for me to draw a map on where the peace talks are going at the moment, because it's everything is very new with the new administration. We have heard their plans. We have heard that they support the peace process, but also Biden has made it clear that he is in favor of keeping some military presence in Afghanistan, which I think is the right thing to do. And until we reach a political settlement in Afghanistan that brings all sides together, I think that would be the right thing for Afghanistan to do. Predicting how it will go will be difficult, but from my opinion, there are things that can happen, measures that can be taken that can lead us into a better conclusion. First and foremost, I think the United States should create a unified plan that is backed by all the administration. The military is backing it, the administration is backing it, the forces at play in Afghanistan are backing it. And that way it can be more inclusive, and also we can see results so that everybody is on the same page and agrees. The other thing that the next administration can do is refocus their resources, their power, and put pressure on all actors inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, India, Russia. We all know how they are taking an interest in this vacuum that will be created if the United States leaves without this political settlement. So the focus should be the political settlement, but also the United States should put pressure on these countries, including the government of Afghanistan, including the other actors inside Afghanistan, to come together and cooperate together to make this peace deal a reality for the Afghanistan and for the Afghan nation. I think that these two important elements, if the next administration focuses on these two things, put the focus on making a political settlement in Afghanistan work, because we all know that the American people and the American politics, they are tired of the Afghan war, and so are the people of Afghanistan, and we all want to put an end to this war and reach a negotiated settlement. But we need that to happen in a way that can last, that can bring stability to Afghanistan, and that can result in better cooperations between the United States, Afghanistan and the region, which will result in betterment of Afghanistan in general and the world, I think. So I'll stop there, but if there are more questions, I'll take it.
Well, thank you. You do raise quite a few important issues and again questions as well. This issue of lack of transparency in the past months or so in the process of negotiations, peace negotiations, is an important issue. A lack of a clear idea on the part of the Trump administration, again, on the peace issue, not having a unified view of the end state of peace in Afghanistan and the process of peace. Again, a very, very crucial and important issue. But this panel is also about the bilateral relations between Afghanistan and the United States. And now we talked a lot about the United States side, and we raised some very logical and important questions on the American side. How about the Afghan side? What do you think now going into the next administration in Washington, D.C.? What do you expect the Afghan side? And by the Afghan side, I mean the Afghan government, obviously at the center and at the top, it is the Afghan government. But at the same time, the non-state actors, non-state political actors within Afghanistan. From what I see, there is also not a very clear and coherent idea about, both the end state of peace and the process of reaching to that end state on the Afghan side either. Could you comment on that and what you think the responsibility of the Afghan government would be on that and the other political actors?
I think the Afghan government has been creating more barriers than they have been helping the process. I think that the recent conclusions, the challenges that they have been keep putting on the process of the peace process have made it even more difficult to reach a conclusion. And I think the administration in Kabul was in a way causing delays and causing distractions to see if Trump is going to win or Biden is going to win. And now I think there is this hope among the government that maybe with this administration, they can move forward. But I think the government of Afghanistan has this historic responsibility. The leaders of Afghanistan have this historic responsibility to put their personal interest aside for once and think about Afghanistan and think about the generations that are going to look at this event and judge them based on that. I think what is driving our leaders is their personal interests. That includes the government, that includes the administration, that includes the leaders of different political parties that are active in Afghanistan. I think if they manage to put that aside and if they manage to think about Afghanistan and think about the interest of Afghanistan, then I think they can come together and actually take this process to a political settlement and agree to work together. But at the moment, I think that it's a little hard to imagine given the challenges that we see.
Great. Well, thank you, Narges-Jan. Thank you very much. Very important points, great issues, awesome analysis. Thank you. With that, I'd like to move on to Mr. Lonas Kaskenis. And Mr. Kaskenis, a lot of issues have been brought up, have been touched upon by the three speakers thus far on the panel. Issues, everything from the inherent American interests in the region, inherent Afghan interest in the relations with the United States, issues of the centrality of Iran. And this is a point that I really would like to come back to Professor Barry at the end of the panel, because I'd like to ask a few more sort of clarifying points on that from Professor Barry. One of the other issues is, in fact, one of the main issues here is the regional dynamics with regard to Afghanistan, with regard to the peace process in Afghanistan, and with regard to the American presence in Afghanistan. Now, given the various conflicting interests, I mean, we have conflicting interests in Afghanistan from a lot of regional and global powers. We've got rivalries between the United States and Russia here. We've got rivalries between the US and China here. We have rivalries between India and Pakistan here, rivalries between Iran and the US, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and you name it, a ton of rivalries are happening here. Given this really dynamic, fluid, and really complicated regional environment, the government of Afghanistan have come up now very recently with a new foreign policy approach, and that they call multilateralism and multi-alignment. What they mean by that is that Afghanistan obviously needs its main strategic partners, i.e. the United States, NATO, Europe, Australia, and other powers, little global powers. Equally important, if not more so, are the regional powers. We need to get along with Pakistan. We need to get along with Iran. We need good relations with India. We need good relations with Russia, China, Turkey, and other states. I was wondering if you could focus your talk, your remarks on that as to, first of all, do you think this policy of multilateralism and multi-alignment is possible? What are the pros and cons of it? How can the Afghan government fulfill this? How can the United States, as the most important strategic ally of Afghanistan, support it in this realm?
Thank you very much for that. I will briefly touch on that because I really want to concentrate, obviously, on the bilateral portion that you described earlier, because I think there's a lot to unfold in that. But I will comment on the fact that I've always pictured Afghanistan not as a place of divergent strategies, and quite frankly, to consider its importance over the decades that we've been associated with it. But then, as Professor Berry mentioned, the centuries that have kind of come before us, I tend to look at it as been not just a strategic crossroad, but more of a crossroad of strategies. Different people and different entities have had various strategies. I think there's a convergence that could occur here as in comparison to colonial or imperial 18 and 1900s, where maybe there were a lot of divergence and conflicting strategies. Russia doesn't want ISIS to come towards its borders. They don't want Islamic fundamentalism coming through their borders. The same, if you think of ISIL or ISIS as an entity, you don't want that to go into Iran. They certainly would like to keep that out. If we look at opportunities for convergence, I think we're far better off than looking for reasons to stay clear of each other. Professor Berry's comment about Chabahar, it's always a zeros or ones kind of dynamic with sanctions, but nonetheless, for an Afghan perspective, the notion of Chabahar or Gwadar port are very real and opportunistic in some ways. So we need to look at, what works best for Afghanistan. That's not something that the U.S. should get involved in as much as, if anything, look for opportunities to create more sustainable options for Afghanistan. But I think if I come back to I'll answer it by saying multilateralism is the way of our century, and some would argue the latter part of our last century. So I'm wholly on board and think that should be the way forward. But in terms of our relationship with Afghanistan, the U.S. that is, I think clarity is important. And I think all your guests thus far and fellow panelists have kind of identified that there's been a lack of clarity and I would submit to you, it's not just President Trump's administration. You can go back to the Obama and even the Bush administrations and find a similar lack of clarity. So I'll just lay out, if this was my advice to whether it's continuing President Trump or whether it's, the President-elect Biden's administration, here's my advice either way. Our agreement is with the Afghan government, which in my opinion represents the Afghan people for all its challenges of the election last of the Afghan people. It still represents, the government represents the people. And as far as I'm concerned, the bilateral security agreement between the US and Afghanistan takes priority over everything else that is being addressed in anything that we're talking about. So the notion of any sort of US-Taliban agreement having any sort of primacy or even being discussed in the same sentence with the bilateral security agreement is not only dumb, but it's also insulting. And I find that strategically naive, not just, a particular propensity of Yanni or all the panelists here being pro-Afghan and somehow Afghan nerds about what we've committed our lives to as an interest and as a commitment of our purpose. But it's more practicality of it. As an American, I look what's best for my country, and the best for my country is a strong bilateral security agreement with the government of Afghanistan that can stand on its own and take greater part in governance. So I think that that's important to clarify. BSA versus US-Taliban agreement, it shouldn't even be addressed. The election is an opportunity to reset, as far as I'm concerned again, of clarity. Both President Trump or President Biden have similar, as weird as this sounds, similar approaches to this. President Trump sees it as return on investment. So he doesn't want a heavy footprint because he sees it as a burn rate. He's not getting enough for his investment, and he's a businessman and sees it as a, if this is a bankruptcy issue, he wants to get out of it. So return on investment is important. But then again, a Vice President Biden during the Obama administration, I mean, if you look at patterns, wanted a very low footprint of a counterterrorism centric approach to US involvement in Afghanistan, and not a 160,000 troop investment that turned out to be a rather, burst of money, but not really a significant positivity, if you want to think of it. If anything, you can see the Taliban movement exploding after that balloon of forces entered, not before. So I think that a sustainability and a return on investment would be the central item for either one of these administrations moving forward. And, in terms of Pamela's comment about a return to a military centric or listen to the military more, I sincerely hope not. I sincerely hope that the attention to this is paid insofar as holding our own government to account for its challenges, because the military has, in large part, achieved its goal in Afghanistan. We have the strong Afghan national security forces. Can it get better? Yes. But there is a national security force in Afghanistan to do the job of countering whether it's domestic or foreign entities that are challenging Afghanistan. Where we have failed miserably, and it's both administration Biden and Obama and administration Trump, is the governance issue in Afghanistan has not been a priority. We've had a Ghani administration, a President Ghani administration for the first 5 years that did not match its promises for electoral reform, for some of the other issues that it ran on and quite frankly promised it would do. So a second Ghani administration cannot fall short of those, because whether it's President Biden or President Trump is just not going to work out very well for Afghanistan if at 2024 we're still having the same conversations. So again, I think that the governance issue is what we should be focusing in on, and not necessarily just the military aspect. The last thing I'll bring up, and I hope I stay within my time limits, is
You're good.
look, I'm a realist when it comes to certain things, but that's because unlike politicians that quite frankly are not held to account for not remembering lessons learned of the past, if you consider yourself an Afghan nerd, you have to take into account a history. And part of my challenge is that we have people who are supposed to be experts, or at a minimum, longtime Afghan hands, that are pretending that this farce of a Doha process is going to get us anywhere except more violence and except more blood. So I want to make it clear that in my mind, if I was speaking to either president right now, I would say that the road to peace is not through Doha. It's not even through DC. It's through Kabul. It's through Maidanshar. It's through Mazar. It's through Jalalabad. It's through Kandahar. It's through even our lovely city and favorite of Herat. You cannot pretend that you're going to fix things by dealing with just the political representation of a militant movement that is out to hurt the majority of people. While we're talking about Doha, the Taliban have launched massive assaults in all of in Wardak, all of Ghazni, Helmand, almost we lost Lashkargah. Kandahar is one vehicle-borne attack after another. How is this remotely anything that we can address by saying we need to minimize violence or violence it's a joke. So I don't look at things as I wish they would be. I look at them as they are. So that's where I would stop, and obviously look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Totally, I could not agree more with you on this issue of the Doha process and the meaning of peace and where the peace negotiations should go and where it should start. And it means absolutely, in my view, spot on. If I could ask you to just talk, maybe take 2 more minutes and clarify a little bit more on that issue of the bilateral security relation. Now, let's set aside the other economic, cultural, everything else aside, specifically talk about, I'm a security man, so I'm mainly interested in that area. From a specific bilateral security area, what would be an arrangement that could be both sustainable and affordable for the United States, and that could actually be worth their while in Afghanistan, strictly from a national interest perspective in the United States, that would also give the Afghan government breathing room so it can actually take things along, and whenever down the road it reaches to peace with the Taliban, then it would be a meaningful peace, it would be a dignified peace, and a sustainable one. What would be that arrangement? Very quickly.
Yeah, it's thank you for that. There's 2 aspects of it that I would submit to you. First of all, and it goes in line with your earlier comment about we act in our national interests and not just emotions or anything like that. So it's in the US national interest to maintain a footprint in Afghanistan. It's in the Central Asian strategic crossroads, as others have said. But again, it's in our mind, we are not going to be rid of Al-Qaeda or the son of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the son of ISIS. So I think we need to maintain a small footprint. I would submit to you that specifically speaking, I'd say probably in the realm of 3,000 to 4,000 troops. And whenever you have 3,000 to 4,000 troops, you really have about 1,000 troops that do something and about 3,000 troops that are supporting the 1,000 that do something. So I would say that is away from the cities. That is perhaps even Bagram, but then a small headquarters that's more of a military assistance command of sorts that helps Afghanistan do all the fighting and defending and everything else that needs to happen. But I can also tell you that there needs to be a presence, because if there's financial investment in Afghanistan, the US Congress that pays our bills, that is the power of the purse, is going to have accountability for whatever we give. We can't give money and then see whatever we're giving, whether it's cars, airplanes, or boxes, end up in some bazaar somewhere. So it's going to have to be something that we pay attention to. So in my mind, to be very specific, again, it's a small footprint, some form of basing, and the idea is that we are in a long, committed relationship with Afghanistan. This is not one-term administration or 2-term administration consideration. This is Korea. This is Germany. This is a long-term play. If we keep on getting past this episodic, we're just going to get out in the next, before the next elections in the US cycle, it's just stupid. I mean, I wish I could designate it somehow otherwise, but it's just naive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kiskanis. It actually, coincidentally, I've been thinking along the exact same lines in terms of what that footprint would mean, what that sustainable residual force remaining from the United States here in Afghanistan would mean, and how that would actually help the Afghan government in Afghanistan. It's reassuring to think that to see that one of the foremost experts in the region also thinks along the same way that I do. Thank you for that. And now we get to the last but not the least speaker of this panel, Mr. Mohammad Voizi. Now, Mr. Voizi, you've been a journalist, you're a writer, you're a commentator, you are a civil society activist. I always enjoy your comments in the media in Afghanistan, and that's great. Could you, obviously, feel free to talk about any aspects of the issues discussed thus far in the panel, but I was also wondering if you could touch base on the more society to society aspects of these bilateral relations, or the society-centric aspects of these relations. In your view, as an observer, writer, commentator, thinker, do you really think the American people really know Afghanistan after 19 years? I mean, for me as an Afghan American, I wear two hats, I go back and forth, I commute between Kabul and Atlanta, and I still have mixed feelings about that as to whether or not Americans really know Afghanistan and whether or not Afghans really know the United States. If you could touch base on that society to society relations, how would that society to society relations really matter in this larger strategic state-centric relations? And if they do matter, how could those be improved? If you could touch base on that. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for this time. And at the beginning, I say hello to all panelists that participate to this program. If you let me, Mr. Aryan Sharif, I have some comment about the Afghanistan and American relationship, especially on the end of the Trump presidency on peace process in Doha, that have some consequences and Afghan people affected by these consequences. And this is very important, and I have some paper, and I briefly talk about that, if you let me.
Please.
Okay. Actually, one sentences in the book of Mr. Fukuyama is the end of history means liberal democracy is the final form of government for all nations. This is a very important point for the Afghanistan and American relationship during 2 decades that we had it. America, as a powerful country, have some soft values, some importance of values that is important to treat with the other country, especially in the Middle East and in our third world country as Afghanistan. When USA Army came to Afghanistan, the most writers and specialists in international relations says that USA wants to expand the liberal democracy in Afghanistan. And this matter, especially in 2 last decades, show and experiences in different time and in more program that the USA found them and USA support them, as the USA support the Afghan government and the elections in Afghanistan. The United States, as a supporter of liberal democracy and democratic values and the political system of democracy, plays an important role in supporting the emerging democracies in the world. In fact, the United States support political system by supporting liberal democracy. As the idealists have repeatedly pointed out in political science theoretical texts, democracies never fight with each other in the world. Therefore, one of the ways to create security in the world can be done in the light of the spread of democracy as a political system to other parts of the world. On this basis, the policies of expanding and supporting the emerging democracy system are justified. Due to the experiences of previous political system, the people of Afghanistan also tried to align themselves with the world political and work together to create a new democratic structure in Afghanistan and have it their own share. Afghanistan 20-year effort to create a new democratic system is significant from different perspectives. One, the people of Afghanistan are in a new social political arena and can use the facilities and benefits from the democratic community countries and create a political model of democracy for their political future. Despite all the problems of the political leaders who also try to act according the rules of the game in Afghanistan, especially in the elections, the institutionalization of democracy as a political system accelerated ethnic, linguistic, and cultural difference between political leaders and ethnic influential people. Liberal democracy increased the hope for state building and nation building among the people of Afghanistan. And these features in the last 2 decades have some consequences, especially when the USA went to Doha to negotiate with the Taliban as the main enemy of Afghanistan state and Afghan people and Afghan state. This matter is very important for me as an analyst, and I want to share with you the consequences of this peace process for Afghan people. Negotiating with the Taliban, recognition of the Taliban as a significant political and military force in political scene of Afghanistan and the region, and make them an important actor in the region. Releasing thousands of the Taliban prisoners from Afghan prisons and strengthening the Taliban military technically, and increase war and violence inside the Afghanistan. And innocent people in this war are killed, and the Taliban find this way that as much as they kill the innocent people more, they can find a political solution for their goals. Negotiating with the Taliban in the first stage show that it is not possible to fight terrorism and radical fundamentalism in the region, and this makes us seek security inside the country and in the international environment throughout policies and dialogue with the terrorists. And this matter make them so powerful, and a small group of the Taliban that they have never mentioned in Afghanistan politics, they can play as an important actor in the region, and they invited by the region countries, especially our neighborhood countries, for having their political agenda in Afghanistan. Negotiating with the Taliban weakened the Afghan central government. This matter is very important because USA at the last 2 decades tried to empower the central government of Afghanistan, but this negotiation is against their agenda and their policies, and recognize two sovereignty in one territory means a lack of full commitment and full support for the central government of Afghanistan. Negotiating with Taliban has down the civil, political, and cultural activities, as well as Afghan society as a whole. Talking and negotiating with terrorists is against US policy.
Maybe we take 2 more minutes, Mr. Voizi, because we're kind of ending towards the end, edging towards the end.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please continue. You've got 2 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. The fundamental forces at the regional level have come to conclusion that if they massacre enough innocent people, they can be recognized as a political power. And this feature, I think, spread out of Afghanistan and cover all the region, not limited only in Afghanistan. And maybe fundamental groups grew up in other countries around Afghanistan and maybe in Middle East. Again, the decision means the defeat of the democratic system against radical Islamic fundamentalism in the region. Therefore, it is not possible to increase international security by increasing democratic values and the political system of democracy. I'm going to the end and say this negotiating with the Taliban changed Afghan-USA relationship, and Afghans maybe trust less on cooperation with USA in future, and promoting Afghan government as a liberal democratic system is more going hard and hard in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Voizi. You obviously raised a lot of important points, both theoretical and empirical in this discussion. Thank you very much, and highlighted quite a number of points, particularly this issue of the importance of the potential defeat of democracy and liberalism in the face of Islamic fundamentalism if we do not really proceed with the peace negotiations in a rational and thoughtful manner. Thank you for that. Well, thank you all. Now, before I wrap up and before I sum up the panel, I would like to very briefly go back to Professor Michael Berry, and I think he has got some few points and introductions to have on what the other panelists talked about. But I also would like to ask Professor Berry to highlight a little bit more, if you could go into some very specific, again, very quickly, because we are out of time here, on this issue of the importance of Iran to Afghanistan and to the United States' presence and interest in Afghanistan and in the region. Now, we all know that relations between the United States and Iran are not very good, to say the least. But given the issue, given that issue and given the problems, is there a way that we can have an exception on Afghanistan? If you could really have a 2-minute talk here, Professor Berry, we would highly appreciate it. And then I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Okay, since Iran is mostly on your mind, I believe that resumption of dialogue between Washington and Tehran will contribute first to lessen sectarian tension throughout the region. We have seen how when Pakistan was created, for example, issues about who was a Shi'i and who was a Sunni were dormant. The communities lived together. In the Iraqi space, they had found ways of living together. When I think Iran made the terrible mistake of calling for the overthrow of the Saudi Arabian government in 1979, made a fresh enemy for itself, along with the United States came to take the side of Saudi Arabia and the Pakistani military in promoting the idea that support for extreme Sunni fundamentalism would be a way not only of rolling back Soviet influence, but also Iranian influence. And this stoked what has been a resurgence of sectarian hatred, which we see playing out notably in Afghanistan with the way Daesh carves out a political ideology for itself by targeting Afghan Shi'is with great cruelty and continually. It's not an accident or an isolated incident. So if only the US and Tehran resume dialogue, these sectarian tensions of themselves will lower, and that is a contribution for the entire region. I want to answer all of you, and I hope you don't think that I have a negative point of view regarding Afghanistan. To the contrary, I would call for a much more positive view. I certainly believe and totally agree that a military presence, reduced, tight, taut, effective, is nevertheless also important in order to maintain American funding for development projects. It's simply a sine qua non. That said, and I want to express my outrage, please, because I think it's symbolic. You may have seen the article in the American military magazine Stars and Stripes considering sewage in Kabul. It summarizes the entire problem. To wit, the US Embassy's waste is dumped into Kabul River, not directly, but because the US Embassy farmed out sewage disposal to an Afghan company, which then dumps the waste into Kabul River, thereby negatively impacting the population of the capital city of the country and underlining this negative lack of interest that I decry on the part even of the American embassy, not even concerned to exercise the most minimal oversight over something that is destroying the health of the population of the capital of an allied country. So I'm outraged throughout. I believe positively that it is in US interest to contribute through responsible Afghan government partnership to the rehabilitation of Kabul and certainly other cities as a decent place for human beings to live. In its current conditions, I think the Afghan capital is a living disgrace. So completely to support what the other panelists have said, all of them, help give the Afghan people something tangible to support. You want to block extremist ideologies and you allow the capital city of the country that you're allied to rot. That is absurd. It is grotesque. And I will fault here not just the Trump administration, but the administrations that preceded it in what I think is criminal neglect of the most obvious services that an alliance should be able to bring about. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Got that
Professor
off my
Barry.
chest.
Thank you for that really important and really exhilarating point. I mean, it's perhaps the most important point there is. Well, thank you all. I noted quite a lot of points, very, very important points. I think we had a very good, really engaging panel. I think we touched upon a lot of important issues. To have 1 hour or so over to talk about, United States, Afghanistan, bilateral relations, it's really nothing, the time, I mean. But in that short span of time, the distinguished speakers we had on the panel had a great discussion. Let me highlight just a few of the main important points. Again, I pointed a lot of issues. I'm just going to highlight just a few of the most important points that I noted in this panel. The first thing that I actually noticed that every single of the speakers really agreed about is the necessity for having clarity in the bilateral relations between Afghanistan and the United States going forward. We have had 19 years. Now we are at a crossroads. What really these bilateral relations are going to mean and how they are going to go forward, both the United States and Afghanistan at the state and the society level need to be really clear on that. And connected to that, the second point that I noted was the importance of a long-term, affordable and sustainable US presence in Afghanistan. And I'm going to underline the words affordable and sustainable for the United States, such that it would actually meet both the interests of the United States in Afghanistan and in the region, and it would also meet the interests of Afghanistan in that relation and in that presence here. And Mr. Kaskenes really went into some good details on that, and I thank him again for that. The other point that I noticed was sort of cross-cutting was the issue of peace with the Taliban, that peace cannot go in Doha. Peace cannot be in Doha. It cannot really be in Norway. It cannot really be in Washington or elsewhere. Real peace, if we really mean real peace, it has to be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned, and it has to really happen in Afghanistan. And I saw that either directly or indirectly, every single of the panelists here touched upon that and agree with that. The other issue that pretty much everybody agrees upon and talked about was this issue of regional dynamics. Now, Afghanistan apparently is located in a region that is that could be conflicting, that these conflicts could be a divergence of cooperation in a way if policies were to be changed. Now, having the bilateral relations between Afghanistan and the United States, in those relations, it is important to have the regional dynamics in mind and fix up those relations that could be both not only sustainable and affordable for the two countries, but also has these other interests in mind in the region. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible and sustainable. And for that, the issue of multilateralism and multi-alignment that's been spearheaded by the Afghan government right now seems to be the most rational course of action. The other point is this issue of sovereignty of power in Afghanistan. And it, to me, every single panelist agreed upon that the only sovereign power in Afghanistan is the government of Afghanistan. Just, it may have problems, it may have issues, it may have weaknesses. Nevertheless, it is the only and the sole sovereign power in Afghanistan. And in these bilateral relations, the United States has to really recognize that and take that into account. And finally, the last point that I noted was this issue that Mr. Voizi pointed out, that it is really not the relations between the United States and Afghanistan in the past 19 years. This war has not only been an American and an Afghan issue, it's really been, in a sense, an issue between liberalism and democracy and freedom and humanity versus fundamentalism and terrorism and darkness and blindness. So now, are we really, if the United States is going to pull out, is it only pulling out of Afghanistan, or is it really accepting the defeat of democracy in the face of Islamic fundamentalism? And what would that mean beyond Afghanistan in the region and the world is pretty obvious and clear. Other points, we are really out of time. I've been getting a lot of comments by our management here. Again, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Professor Dr. Michael Barry, who was with us from Venice. I'd like to thank Mr. Lonis Kaskenes, who was with us from the Middle East in the Zoom. I'd like to thank Ms. Pamela Constable, who was in Washington, D.C. from the United States, joining us. And I'd like to thank Ms. Nargis Ozeriyoun and Mr. Mohammad Voizi from Kabul. And I'm in Herat. Thank you very much for the great panel and the discussion. Thank you.